The dust had caked so thick in Willa Norton's mouth that she could no longer remember what water tasted like. And when she stumbled over the next rise in the rocky terrain, she knew with cold certainty that these hills would become her grave. The Wyoming wilderness stretched endlessly in every direction, unforgiving and vast, a landscape that cared nothing for the desperate prayers of a 22-year-old woman whose traveling companions had abandoned her 3 days prior, when the wagon wheel shattered and supplies ran dangerously low. They had taken the remaining horse, the last of the dried meat, and every canteen, leaving her with nothing but the tattered dress on her back and shoes that had worn through at the soles. Her vision blurred as she forced one foot in front of the other, the September sun of 1876 beating down mercilessly, despite the mountain air. She had been walking for days without food, rationing the last few drops of water from a muddy creek she had found yesterday morning. Or had it been the day before? Time had lost all meaning when hunger gnawed so viciously at her insides that she could think of nothing else. Willa collapsed against a boulder, her legs finally giving out. She should have stayed in Philadelphia. She should never have believed Thomas when he promised a better life out west. Should never have trusted that theater troupe that called themselves a family. But Thomas had died of cholera in a Nebraska town called Valentine, and the rest of the group had grown tired of supporting a grieving woman who could barely perform through her tears. They had let her travel with them as far as Wyoming before deciding she was more trouble than she was worth. The sound of rushing water reached her ears, and she wondered if death was already playing tricks on her mind. But no, there it was again, the unmistakable burble of a stream somewhere nearby. Willa crawled on her hands and knees toward the sound, ignoring the sharp stones that bit into her palms, and the way her vision kept darkening at the edges. She found the creek at the bottom of a small ravine, and she half fell, half slid down the rocky slope to reach it. The water was clear and cold, and she plunged her face into it, drinking so deeply that she choked and had to pull back, coughing. Easy, she told herself. Too much too fast would make her sick. But discipline was nearly impossible when every cell in her body screamed for sustenance. After she had drunk her fill and splashed water on her sun-scorched face, Willa tried to climb back up the slope. Her hands kept slipping, and she made it only halfway before sliding back down. She tried again with the same result. The third time, her arms simply would not obey her commands. She lay at the bottom of the ravine, staring up at the late afternoon sky, and felt tears leak from the corners of her eyes. This was how it would end then. At least she had water. At least she would not die with that terrible thirst clawing at her throat. The sound of footsteps made her turn her head weakly. A man stood at the top of the ravine, silhouetted against the sun, and for a moment she thought her dying mind had conjured an angel. Then he moved, and she saw he was flesh and blood, tall and broad-shouldered, with long dark hair that fell past his collar and a rifle slung across his back. "Help," she managed to croak, but the word came out barely louder than a whisper. The man descended the slope with the ease of someone who had spent his entire life in these mountains. As he drew closer, Willa could see his face more clearly. He had strong, angular features, a jaw shadowed with several days' worth of beard, and eyes the color of pine trees. His forearms, visible where his shirt sleeves were rolled up, were corded with muscle, and his chest and shoulders strained against the fabric of his worn shirt. He looked like he had been carved from the very mountains themselves, solid and immovable. "Can you stand?" His voice was deep, rough from disuse, as though he did not speak often. Willa tried to push herself up and failed. "I do not think so." He knelt beside her, and she could see concern flicker across his weathered face. "When did you last eat?" "I do not know. 3 days. 4. He muttered something under his breath that might have been a curse. Then, without warning, he scooped her up in his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. Willa was too exhausted to protest, too weak to do anything but let her head rest against his broad chest as he carried her up the ravine slope with steady, confident steps. "My cabin is not far," he said. "Hold on." Willa tried to stay conscious, tried to see where he was taking her, but the combination of movement and the safety of being carried after so many days of terror made her body decide it could finally rest. She drifted in and out of awareness as he walked, catching only fragments. The creak of a door, the smell of wood smoke, the sensation of being laid down on something soft. When she woke fully, it was to find herself on a bed covered in furs, with a rough wool blanket pulled up to her chin. The cabin was small but well built, with a stone fireplace where a fire crackled cheerfully. The man was stirring something in a pot that hung over the flames, and the smell that wafted toward her made her stomach clench with desperate hunger. He turned when he heard her stir. "You are awake. Good. I have soup." He ladled some of the steaming liquid into a wooden bowl and brought it to her. When Willa tried to sit up, the room spun sickeningly, and he quickly set the bowl aside to help her, propping her up against the wall with surprising gentleness for someone so large and clearly capable of violence. "Slowly," he warned as he handed her the bowl and a spoon. "Your stomach will not thank you if you rush." The soup was simple, just broth with bits of meat and wild onions, but it was the most delicious thing Willa had ever tasted. She wanted to gulp it down, but she heeded his warning and took small, careful sips. The warm liquid seemed to breathe life back into her body with each swallow. "Thank you," she whispered when the bowl was half empty and she needed to pause. "I thought I was going to die." "You nearly did." He sat down in a rough-hewn chair near the fire, watching her with those steady green eyes. "What is a woman doing out here alone?" Willa told him, the words spilling out in a halting rush. She told him about Thomas, about the theater troupe, about being abandoned with nothing. She told him about walking until her feet bled, about the terror of hearing wolves howl in the night, about praying for death and then praying to live just a little longer. The man listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "My name is Flynn Barrett," he said finally. "I have lived in these mountains for 6 years. You are safe here, Willa Norton." She managed a weak smile, "and I am more grateful than I can express." Flynn stood and took the empty bowl from her hands. "Rest now. You need sleep more than anything. We can talk more tomorrow." Willa wanted to protest, wanted to ask 100 questions, but her body had other ideas. The moment she lay back down, sleep pulled her under like a warm tide. She woke several times during the night, disoriented and frightened, only to see Flynn sitting by the fire, keeping watch. Each time he noticed her stirring and spoke quietly. "Sleep. You are safe." And each time she believed him and drifted off again. Morning came with pale light filtering through the cabin's single window. Willa felt stronger, though still weak, and she managed to sit up on her own. Flynn was already awake, tending to the fire and preparing more food. He glanced over when he heard her moving. "How do you feel?" "Better." "Still weak, but better." She looked down at herself and realized she was still in her filthy, torn dress. "I must look a fright." "You look alive. That is what matters." He brought her another bowl of soup, this one thicker than the night before, with chunks of venison and root vegetables. "Eat. Then, if you are strong enough, you can wash. I have a creek out back." The soup gave her strength, and after she finished, Flynn helped her to her feet. Her legs trembled but held. He led her outside, and Willa got her first good look at his homestead in daylight. The cabin was nestled in a small valley surrounded by towering pines, with a clear creek running behind it. There was a small garden plot, now mostly harvested for the winter, and a shed that likely held supplies. Smoke rose from the cabin chimney into the crisp mountain air. "It is beautiful," she said softly. Flynn glanced at her, something that might have been surprise flickering across his face, as though no one had ever complimented his home before. "The creek is just there. I will leave you some soap and a clean shirt. Take your time." He was as good as his word, leaving her a bar of lye soap and one of his own shirts, which would be enormous on her but infinitely better than the rags she wore. Then he disappeared back into the cabin, giving her privacy. Willa stripped off her ruined dress with relief and waded into the creek. The water was shockingly cold, but it felt glorious to wash away days of dust and sweat and fear. She scrubbed herself with the soap, washing her long auburn hair as best she could, and when she finally emerged and pulled on Flynn's shirt, she felt almost human again. The shirt hung to her knees, and she had to roll the sleeves up several times, but it was clean and soft from wear. When she returned to the cabin, Flynn was working on something at a rough table. He looked up, and his gaze lingered on her for just a moment before he returned his attention to his task. Willa realized he was mending a pair of boots, likely his spare pair, and that they would probably fit her better than her destroyed shoes. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the chair by the fire. "You should not be on your feet too long yet." Willa obeyed, settling into the chair and feeling warmth seep into her bones. "Flynn, I need to ask, why are you helping me? You do not know me, I could be anyone." He continued working on the boots, his strong hands surprisingly deft with the leather and needle. "These mountains are hard. They kill people who are not prepared. You did not deserve to die because some cowards left you behind. Still, most men would not be so kind." Flynn looked up then, his green eyes meeting hers directly. "I am not most men, and I have been alone up here long enough to forget what it is like to have someone to talk to. You can stay until you are strong enough to travel. Then I will take you to the nearest town if you wish." Something in Willa's chest tightened at the thought of leaving, though she could not explain why. She had known this man less than a day, but there was something about him, something solid and safe, that made her want to stay in this cabin forever. "What brought you to the mountains?" she asked instead. Flynn was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. Then he set down his tools and leaned back in his chair. "I was a soldier, fought in the war. When it ended, I could not go back to cities, to people. Too much noise, too many memories. I came west and kept going until I found a place where I could not hear anything but wind and water." Willa understood, or thought she did. She had seen soldiers in Philadelphia, men who came back from the war with haunted eyes and shaking hands. "Do you ever miss it? Civilization?" "No." The answer was immediate and firm. "I have everything I need here. I hunt, I trap, I trade furs in town twice a year for supplies I cannot make. It is a good life." "Lonely, though." Flynn glanced at her again, and something shifted in his expression, something she could not quite read. "Yes." "Lonely." They fell into a comfortable silence after that, and Willa found herself studying him. Flynn Barrett was probably in his late 20s or early 30s, though the mountains had weathered him in a way that made it hard to tell. He moved with efficiency and purpose, each action deliberate and controlled. His body was all hard muscle and power, built from years of surviving in this harsh environment. But despite his size and obvious strength, he was gentle with her, careful not to crowd her or make her feel threatened. Over the following days, Willa grew stronger. Flynn fed her soup, stew, roasted meat, and pan bread. He never let her go hungry, always making sure she ate enough to regain her strength. She helped around the cabin as much as she was able, washing dishes and mending his clothes, small tasks that made her feel less like a burden. They talked more as the days passed. Willa told him about growing up in Philadelphia, about her love of theater and music, about how Thomas had swept her off her feet with promises of adventure. Flynn listened, and slowly he began to share his own stories. He had grown up on a farm in Ohio, the youngest of 4 sons. When the war broke out, he had enlisted at 18, eager to prove himself. He had seen battles whose names she recognized, had watched friends die, had done things he clearly did not want to describe. When the war ended, he had been 23 and felt ancient. "I wandered for a while," Flynn said one evening as they sat by the fire. "Worked odd jobs, got into fights, drank too much. Then one day I woke up and realized I was killing myself slowly, so I came here instead. And you have been alone ever since?" "Mostly. See a few trappers now and then. The shopkeeper in Casper when I go to trade. But yes, mostly alone. Do you like it?" Flynn looked at her, and in the firelight his eyes were very green and very serious. "I did. Until a few days ago I would have said I never wanted anything else." Willa's breath caught. "And now?" "Now I am not so sure." The air between them suddenly felt charged, heavy with something unspoken. Willa found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn to him in a way that both thrilled and frightened her. She had loved Thomas, or thought she had, but what she felt when Flynn looked at her was different, deeper, more real. Flynn cleared his throat and stood abruptly. "You should rest. It is late." Willa nodded, disappointed but not surprised. She had been sleeping in his bed while he took the floor, and despite her protests, he refused to let her trade places with him. She rose and moved to the bed, acutely aware of his presence as he banked the fire for the night. "Flynn," she said softly, just before he turned away. "Yes." "Thank you for everything." He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought she saw longing in his face. "You are welcome, Willa." She dreamed that night of strong arms and green eyes, of safety and warmth, and woke with her heart racing. Flynn was already up, preparing breakfast, and Willa watched him move around the cabin with easy confidence. She realized with startling clarity that she did not want to leave. She wanted to stay here with this quiet, gentle mountain man who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return. But what could she offer him? She had no money, no possessions, no skills that would be useful in this wilderness. She could cook and sew, but so could he. She could read and write and perform Shakespeare, none of which mattered up here in the mountains. As if sensing her troubled thoughts, Flynn glanced over at her. "You are awake early." "I could not sleep any more." Willa sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "Flynn, I have been thinking. I need to find work, earn money somehow. I cannot impose on you forever." "You are not imposing." "I am eating your food, sleeping in your bed. You have been nothing but kind, but I cannot simply be a burden." Flynn set down the pan he was holding and turned to face her fully. "You are not a burden. I want you here." The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Willa felt her pulse quicken. "You want me here." He crossed the small cabin in 3 strides and knelt beside the bed, bringing himself to her eye level. Up close, she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. "I have been alone for 6 years. I chose that loneliness. I needed it. But then you stumbled into my life, half dead and desperate, and everything changed. These past days with you here have been the best I have had since before the war. So yes, Willa Norton, I want you here. I want you to stay for as long as you are willing." Willa reached out tentatively and touched his bearded cheek. He closed his eyes at the contact, and she felt him tremble slightly. "I want to stay. But Flynn, I do not want to be a guest. I want to be a partner. I want this to be my home too, if you will have me." His eyes opened, and the raw emotion in them took her breath away. "Are you certain? This is a hard life. Winters are brutal. We would be alone except for each other. You would be giving up any chance of returning to civilization." I tried civilization. It took everything from me and gave nothing back. Here with you I feel more at home than I have in years." She cupped his face with both hands now, marveling at the feel of his skin, warm and rough beneath her palms. "I am certain." Flynn leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers. "I will take care of you. I will never let you go hungry. I will never leave you to face the wilderness alone." "I know," Willa whispered. "I trust you." He kissed her then, gentle and tentative at first, as though afraid she might break. But Willa kissed him back with all the emotion she had been holding inside, and Flynn responded by pulling her close, his strong arms wrapping around her as though he would never let go. The kiss deepened, becoming something urgent and necessary, a promise and a claim all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Flynn rested his forehead against hers again. "I have not been with anyone since before the war. I do not know if I remember how to be gentle." "Then we will learn together," Willa said, and kissed him again. They took their time, learning each other slowly. Flynn was indeed gentle, almost reverent, as though Willa was something precious he feared damaging. She traced the scars on his chest and arms, marks of battles and survival, and kissed each one. He buried his hands in her clean auburn hair and told her she was beautiful. They came together with a desperation born of loneliness and need, and afterward they lay tangled in the furs, holding each other as the fire burned low. "Stay with me," Flynn murmured against her hair. "Be my wife. Make a life here with me." "Yes," Willa said simply. "Yes to all of it." They spent the rest of September and all of October preparing for winter. Flynn taught Willa everything she needed to know about surviving in the mountains. He showed her how to preserve meat, how to identify edible plants, how to set snares for rabbits. He took her hunting, and though she could not handle his heavy rifle, he carved her a smaller bow and patiently taught her to use it. She was a quick study, determined to be useful, to be the partner she had promised to be. Willa, in turn, brought things to Flynn's life that he had not realized he was missing. She sang while she worked, filling the cabin with music. She told stories in the evenings, performing scenes from plays she had memorized, and Flynn would sit transfixed, watching her bring characters to life with nothing but her voice and gestures. She laughed freely and often, a sound that seemed to drive the shadows from the corners of the cabin. They worked together to expand the cabin's storage, to chop enough wood to see them through the winter, to make sure they would have everything they needed when the snows came. Flynn was relentless in his preparations, driven by a determination that Willa would never know want or deprivation again. One crisp November morning, Flynn announced they were going to Casper. "We need to be married proper," he said, "and I need to trade furs before the pass closes for winter." They rode down the mountain together on Flynn's sturdy bay horse, Willa sitting in front of him, wrapped in his arms. The journey took 2 days, and they camped one night under the stars. Flynn built a large fire to keep away predators and held Willa close as they slept. She felt safer than she had ever felt in her life. Casper was a rough frontier town, all wooden buildings and muddy streets, but to Willa, it was bustling and exciting after weeks in the solitary mountains. Flynn handled his business efficiently, trading furs for supplies and making sure to buy Willa a proper winter coat, boots that actually fit her, and a few yards of fabric so she could make herself some dresses. They found a circuit preacher at the town's small church, and he married them without fuss, with the shopkeeper and his wife serving as witnesses. Flynn produced a simple gold band that he said had belonged to his mother, and Willa cried as he slipped it onto her finger. They signed their names in the church registry as Flynn Barrett and Willa Barrett, making it official. That night, they stayed at the town's single boarding house, and Flynn made love to his wife in a proper bed. Afterward, Willa lay with her head on his broad chest, listening to his heartbeat and felt completely content. "Are you happy?" Flynn asked quietly. "Happier than I knew was possible," Willa replied honestly. "Are you?" "Yes." His arms tightened around her. "I thought I was content before. I thought loneliness was what I deserved, but you showed me I was just existing, not living. You brought me back to life, Willa. You saved my life first. I think that makes us even." Flynn chuckled, a deep rumble in his chest. "Then we can spend the rest of our lives saving each other every day." They returned to the mountain cabin as the first real snow began to fall. Flynn had been right about the winters being brutal. The snow piled up until it reached the cabin windows, and the wind howled like a living thing. But inside, the cabin was warm and cozy. They kept the fire burning constantly, rationing their wood carefully, but never letting it die. They had plenty of food thanks to Flynn's preparations, and Willa learned to cook in a dozen new ways, making use of their limited ingredients to create varied meals. The long winter nights might have been oppressive in their isolation, but instead, they became something magical. Flynn taught Willa to carve wood, and she proved to have a talent for it, creating small figures of animals and people. Willa taught Flynn to read better, for he had only basic schooling, and they worked through the 3 books she had brought from Philadelphia, which Flynn had retrieved from her abandoned possessions weeks before. They talked for hours, sharing stories from their pasts, their hopes for the future, their fears and dreams. And they made love often, learning each other's bodies with thorough attention, finding joy and comfort in their physical connection. Flynn was an attentive lover, always making sure Willa found her pleasure before seeking his own. She loved the feel of him, all hard muscle and controlled strength, loved the way he could lift her effortlessly, and the way he held her afterward with such tenderness. By the time the snow began to melt in March of 1877, Willa had missed her monthly courses twice and was fairly certain she knew why. She waited until she was sure before telling Flynn, watching his face carefully as she shared the news. "I am with child," she said simply. "The baby should come sometime in late summer." Flynn stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, suddenly, he let out a whoop of joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "A baby! We are going to have a baby! You are happy?" Willa asked, though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Happy, I am thrilled, terrified but thrilled." He set her down carefully as though she might break. "We need to prepare. I need to make a cradle. We need more supplies. You should not be doing heavy work anymore." "Flynn, I am pregnant, not made of glass." But he insisted on doing most of the heavy chores himself from that day forward, refusing to let Willa carry water or chop wood. She rolled her eyes at his protectiveness, but secretly loved it. Flynn was devoted to making sure she was comfortable, that she had everything she needed, that she never overtaxed herself. As spring turned to summer, Willa's belly grew round with their child. Flynn would place his large hand on her stomach and marvel at the movement within, his eyes full of wonder. They spent the warm months preparing for the baby's arrival. Flynn built a beautiful cradle from pine wood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. Willa sewed tiny clothes from soft fabric Flynn had bought in Casper, and she knitted blankets and caps. They talked about names endlessly. Flynn wanted to name a son after his father, Frank, but Willa convinced him that their son should have his own name. They finally settled on William for a boy, Thomas for a middle name in honor of Willa's first love, a gesture of forgiveness and moving forward that made Flynn love her even more. For a girl, they chose Eleanor, a name that meant light. The baby came on a sweltering August night, and Flynn delivered his own son with shaking hands and whispered prayers. Willa labored through the night, with Flynn supporting her, encouraging her, never leaving her side. When the baby finally emerged, squalling and red-faced, Flynn caught him carefully and laid him on Willa's chest, tears streaming down his weathered face. "A son," Willa whispered, exhausted and elated. "We have a son." "William Barrett," Flynn said, his voice rough with emotion. He cut the cord and cleaned the baby gently, then wrapped him in the softest blanket they had made. "He is perfect. You are perfect. I do not deserve either of you." "Yes, you do," Willa said firmly, watching her husband cradle their newborn son with infinite care. "You deserve all the happiness in the world, Flynn Barrett." Life with a baby was harder than either of them had anticipated, but also more rewarding. William was a healthy, hungry infant who demanded constant attention. Flynn proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with his son when he fussed, changing soiled cloths without complaint, and singing to him in a surprisingly good baritone. Willa recovered her strength quickly, and soon they had settled into a new rhythm, one that accommodated their growing family. The winter of 1877 was easier than the previous one, perhaps because they had each other and now William to fill their days and nights. The baby grew strong and healthy, hitting each milestone right on time. He had Flynn's green eyes and Willa's auburn hair, a perfect combination of them both. Spring brought new life to the mountains and new energy to the Barrett household. Flynn expanded the cabin, adding another room so that William could eventually have his own space. Willa planted a larger garden, determined to have fresh vegetables through the summer. They were building a real homestead, a real life together. In the summer of 1878, when William was nearly a year old, Willa discovered she was pregnant again. Flynn's reaction was just as joyful as the first time, though now tempered with the confidence of experience. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because Willa knew what to expect, or perhaps because Flynn had become even more adept at anticipating her needs. Their daughter was born in March of 1879, arriving with the spring thaw. Willa Barrett had her father's dark hair and her mother's blue eyes, and she was a calm, content baby who rarely fussed. William, now a toddling little boy, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything. The years flowed by like the creek behind their cabin, steady and sure. Flynn continued to hunt and trap, providing for his family with the same dedication he brought to everything. Willa managed the household and the garden, and she taught the children to read and write as they grew. William proved to be adventurous and bold like his father, always wanting to explore and learn about the wilderness. Willa was quieter, more thoughtful, with a gift for music that delighted her mother. In 1881, when William was 3 and Willa was 2, Willa gave birth to their third child, a son they named James. He had his father's build and his mother's temperament, a perfect middle ground between his siblings. Flynn now had to add onto the cabin again, creating a proper second bedroom for the children. They made a trip to Casper every summer now, the whole family traveling down the mountain together. The children loved the excitement of town, and Flynn and Willa enjoyed seeing the changes as the frontier slowly became more civilized. But they always returned to their mountain home with relief, grateful for the peace and solitude. Life was not always easy. There were harsh winters when supplies ran low, and everyone was sick of salt pork and dried beans. There were frightening moments, like when William wandered off and Flynn had to track him for 2 terrifying hours before finding him, unharmed and watching a family of deer. There was the time Willa fell and broke her arm, and Willa had to set it while Flynn held their screaming daughter still, both parents crying almost as hard as the child. But the good moments far outweighed the hard ones. There were summer evenings when the whole family would sit outside and watch the stars come out, Flynn pointing out constellations and telling stories about each one. There were winter nights when they would all huddle together by the fire, the children playing while Willa sewed and Flynn carved. There were silly moments of laughter, like when William tried to imitate his father's serious expression, and everyone dissolved into giggles. Flynn proved to be everything Willa had hoped for and more. He was patient with the children, firm but fair, and he taught them everything he knew about surviving and thriving in the wilderness. He loved Willa with a devotion that never wavered, always making sure she knew how much she meant to him. On quiet mornings, he would bring her coffee in bed, a luxury they allowed themselves from their town supplies. On hard days, he would hold her and tell her she was strong enough to handle anything. Willa, in turn, gave Flynn the family and home he had never dared to dream of. She created a sanctuary in the wilderness, a place of warmth and love where the ghosts of war could not reach. She reminded him every day that he was a good man, worthy of love and happiness. She made him laugh, made him think, made him grateful every single day that she had stumbled into his life half-starved and desperate. By 1885, their family was complete. William was 7, Eleanor was 6, and James was 4. The cabin had grown from Flynn's simple bachelor quarters into a proper family home, with 2 bedrooms, a larger main room, and a covered porch where they could sit in the evenings. The garden was productive, and Flynn had built a proper smokehouse for preserving meat. They even had a few chickens now, brought up from Casper as chicks and kept in a secure coop Flynn had constructed. The children were growing up wild and free, healthy and happy. William could track almost as well as his father, and he was learning to handle a rifle safely. Eleanor had a beautiful singing voice and entertained the family with songs in the evening. James was fearless and curious, always getting into mischief but so charming that it was hard to stay angry at him. One evening in late summer, after the children had been put to bed, Flynn and Willa sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over the mountains. Flynn had his arm around his wife, and she leaned against his solid shoulder, perfectly content. "You ever regret it?" Flynn asked quietly. "Giving up everything to stay here with me?" Willa looked up at him, surprised. "Never, not once. Why would you ask that?" "Because you gave up so much. You could have had a life in town with shops and theaters and other women to talk to. Instead, you are stuck on a mountain with me and 3 wild children." Willa reached up and turned his face toward hers. "Flynn Barrett, you listened to me. That day you found me in the ravine, you did not just save my life. You gave me a life worth living. Everything I had before was hollow and empty. Thomas was a kind man, but what I felt for him was nothing compared to what I feel for you. And our children. They are the greatest joy I have ever known. I would not trade a single moment of our life together for all the theaters and shops in the world." Flynn kissed her then, deep and thorough, with all the love and passion that had only grown stronger over the years. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling. "I love you," Flynn said, "more than I have words to express. I love you too, and I always will." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear. From inside the cabin, they could hear the soft sounds of their children sleeping. The creek burbled behind the house, and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine. Everything was exactly as it should be. "Do you remember," Willa said eventually, "that first night when you fed me soup and told me I was safe?" "Of course. I think I started falling in love with you right then. You were so gentle, so careful, even though I was a stranger. You could have turned me away, but you did not. You fed me and sheltered me and asked for nothing in return." Flynn tightened his arm around her. "I could never have turned you away, and as for asking for nothing, that is not quite true. I wanted you to stay from the very beginning. I just did not know how to ask. Well, I am staying. Forever. Forever, Flynn agreed. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. The children grew older, and Flynn taught them everything he knew about the mountains. William became a skilled hunter and trapper, following in his father's footsteps. Eleanor developed a love of growing things and took over much of the garden work, expanding it each year. James proved to have a gift for working with his hands, and he helped Flynn with all the building and repair work around the homestead. As the children became more independent, Flynn and Willa found they had more time for each other again. They would take long walks through the forest, hand in hand, talking about everything and nothing. They made love in the afternoons when the children were occupied, rediscovering the passion that had never really faded. They sat up late at night, planning for the future, dreaming about what life might hold. In 1890, when William was 12, Flynn began teaching him about trapping and hunting in earnest, taking him on longer expeditions into the mountains. Willa worried every time they left, but she trusted Flynn to keep their son safe. And he always did, returning with William full of stories and new knowledge. Eleanor, at 11, announced she wanted to learn to read music properly and perhaps learn to play an instrument. On their next trip to Casper, Flynn used precious savings to buy her a small guitar. It was not expensive or fancy, but Eleanor treasured it and practiced diligently until she could play simple songs. Soon the cabin was filled with music in the evenings, Eleanor playing while the family sang along. James, at 9, was already showing signs of being as large and strong as his father. He had Flynn's build and work ethic, and he took pride in helping maintain the homestead. He was also protective of his mother and sister, already developing the same code of honor that Flynn lived by. The Barrett family became something of a legend in the region. Trappers and prospectors who passed through the area would sometimes stop at their cabin, and Flynn and Willa always offered hospitality, feeding travelers and letting them sleep in the shed if needed. In return, they would hear news of the outside world, of how the frontier was changing, of new towns springing up and railroads pushing west. But no matter how much the world changed, life on the mountain remained constant. The seasons turned, the family grew, and the love between Flynn and Willa deepened with each passing year. In 1893, on a crisp autumn morning, Flynn and Willa celebrated their 16th wedding anniversary. The children surprised them with breakfast in bed, a rare treat, and Eleanor played a song she had written especially for the occasion. William had carved them a beautiful picture frame, and James had picked wildflowers to put on the table. After breakfast, Flynn took Willa's hand and led her outside. They walked to their favorite spot, a small clearing with a view of the entire valley, and sat together on the boulder where they had spent countless hours over the years. 16 years, Flynn mused. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I found you by the creek. Other times it feels like you have always been here. Because I belong here, Willa said. With you, always with you. Flynn pulled something from his pocket. It was a carved wooden pendant, shaped like a heart and polished until it gleamed. I made this for you. It is not much, but I wanted you to have something special. Willa took the pendant, tears springing to her eyes. On one side, Flynn had carved their initials intertwined. On the other, he had carved the date they met. It is beautiful, perfect. Help me put it on. Flynn fastened the leather cord around her neck, and Willa touched the pendant, feeling the smooth wood against her skin. I will never take it off. Good. Flynn kissed her temple. Because I never want you to forget how much I love you, how grateful I am for every day we have together. As if I could ever forget. Willa turned to face him fully. Flynn, you are my everything. You saved me in every way a person can be saved. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You showed me what real love looks like. I am so proud to be your wife, so grateful to be the mother of your children." They kissed, long and sweet, and then simply held each other, looking out over the valley they called home. Their life was not glamorous or exciting by most standards, but it was theirs, built with their own hands and filled with genuine love and happiness. As the years moved into the late 1890s, the children began to grow into young adults. William, now in his late teens, was essentially a man grown, nearly as tall and broad as his father. He had become an expert outdoorsman, and Flynn trusted him to handle the most challenging hunts and trap lines. He was serious and responsible, but with his mother's kind heart. Eleanor, a few years younger, had blossomed into a beautiful young woman with grace and intelligence. She still loved music and gardening, but she had also developed an interest in herbal medicine, learning which plants could be used to treat ailments. She had saved James from a serious fever the previous winter with her remedies, and Willa was endlessly proud of her daughter's knowledge. James, in his mid-teens, was already larger than most grown men, with his father's powerful build and surprisingly gentle nature. He had Flynn's protective instincts and Willa's empathy, a combination that made him beloved by his entire family. The three siblings were close, their bond forged by years of facing the wilderness together. They worked as a team, each contributing their strengths to the family's welfare. Flynn and Willa often marveled at how well their children had turned out, at how the isolation that might have stunted others had instead made them strong and self-sufficient. In 1898, William surprised everyone by announcing he was courting a girl from Casper, a shopkeeper's daughter named Sarah, whom he had met during their summer trips to town. Flynn and Willa exchanged knowing glances. They had wondered when this day would come, when their children would start building lives of their own. "Bring her to visit," Willa said warmly. "We would love to meet her properly." William did the following summer. Sarah was a sweet, practical young woman who was not afraid of hard work and seemed genuinely enchanted by the mountain homestead. Eleanor took to her immediately, and even James approved, which was high praise indeed. Flynn watched his son with Sarah and recognized the same besotted expression he himself must have worn when courting Willa. By the end of the visit, William and Sarah were officially engaged. They married that fall in Casper, and Flynn and Willa stood proudly as William promised to love and cherish Sarah all his days. The young couple planned to build their own cabin on Barrett land, close enough for family support but far enough for independence. Flynn and William spent the following months working together to build a sturdy home for the newlyweds. Watching his son become a husband and soon to be father himself, Flynn felt the weight of time passing. He was in his early 50s now, his hair streaked with silver, his face more lined. But he was still strong, still capable, and he felt blessed beyond measure. He had built something lasting, something that would continue long after he was gone. One evening, as he and Willa lay in bed, Flynn spoke his thoughts aloud. "I used to think I would die alone on this mountain, that I would just fade away and no one would know or care. But now I will leave behind children and grandchildren, a whole family that exists because you said yes to a life with me." Willa snuggled closer to him. "We built this together, Flynn, you and me. Everything good in my life comes from that day you found me, half dead and hopeless, and decided I was worth saving. You were always worth saving. You were always worth everything." They fell asleep in each other's arms, as they had nearly every night for over 2 decades, and their dreams were peaceful. The new century arrived, bringing with it changes both large and small. William and Sarah welcomed a son in 1901, naming him Flynn after his grandfather. Old Flynn Barrett held his grandson with shaking hands and tears in his eyes, marveling at the continuation of his line, at this proof that his life had mattered. Willa married in 1902, choosing a young doctor she had met in Casper who was moving to a nearby settlement. Willa cried at her daughter's wedding, though they were happy tears. Willa's husband respected her knowledge of herbs and medicine, and together they planned to serve the growing community. She would not be far away, just a day's ride, and she promised to visit often. James showed no interest in courting, preferring to stay on the mountain and help his aging father maintain the homestead. Flynn was grateful for his youngest son's presence, though he encouraged James to live his own life. "I do not want you tied here out of obligation," Flynn said. "It is not obligation," James replied. "This is my home. These are my mountains. Maybe someday I will find someone to share it with, but until then I am exactly where I want to be." By 1905, Flynn and Willa were in their 50s, officially entering their later years. Their bodies were not as spry as they once were, but they were still healthy and active. They had slowed down, certainly, but they could still manage the homestead with James's help. They had 3 grandchildren now, with another on the way, and family gatherings were loud, chaotic, joyful affairs. Flynn still hunted, though not as far or as often as he once did. Willa still gardened, though she let James and his strong back do the heavy digging. They still loved each other with the same intensity they always had, perhaps even more so now that they understood how rare and precious their bond was. On their 30th anniversary in 1907, their entire family gathered at the mountain cabin. William and Sarah brought their children. Willa and her husband made the journey. James prepared a feast. They celebrated for 3 days, with music and laughter and storytelling late into the night. On the last evening, when the younger folks had bedded down and the cabin was quiet, Flynn and Willa slipped outside to sit on their porch. The stars were brilliant overhead and the night was pleasantly cool. 30 years, Willa said softly. "Can you believe it? Some days, no. Other days it feels like we have lived several lifetimes together." Flynn took her hand, his thumb rubbing over the gold band she still wore. "I have no regrets, Willa, not a single one. Neither do I. You fed me soup when I was starving, and you have been feeding my soul ever since." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You never let me go hungry, not for food, not for love, not for anything. You kept your promise. And I always will." Flynn kissed the top of her head. "Until my last breath." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a life of meaning and love. Behind them, the cabin held their children and grandchildren, all sleeping peacefully. Around them, the wilderness stretched vast and wild, the same mountains that had witnessed their meeting now sheltering their family. "You think," Willa asked eventually, "that if I had not been left behind by those people, if I had not been starving and lost, would we have still met somehow?" Flynn considered the question seriously. "I like to think so. I like to think that we were always meant to find each other one way or another. Fate or destiny or just luck, does it matter? What matters is that you are here, that we are here together." "Together," Willa echoed. "Always together." The years rolled on, as gentle and inevitable as the seasons. Flynn and Willa grew older, their hair turning white, their movements slower. But their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, forged by decades of facing life's challenges side by side. They watched their grandchildren grow, and eventually they welcomed great-grandchildren. The Barrett family spread across the region, all of them carrying the values Flynn and Willa had instilled: hard work, honesty, loyalty, and love. The mountain homestead became a gathering place, a touchstone for the entire clan. In the summer of 1915, Flynn fell ill. It was nothing dramatic, just a gradual weakening, a slowing down that could not be stopped. He was 65 years old and had lived a full, rich life, but still, Willa was not ready to let him go. "You cannot leave me," she whispered one night, holding his hand as he lay in their bed. "We are supposed to have more time." Flynn squeezed her hand weakly. "We have had more time than most people ever get. More happiness than I thought existed in the world. Because of you, Willa. All because of you. Because of us," she corrected, tears streaming down her face. "Promise me something," Flynn said. "Promise me you will not grieve too long. You have a family that loves you, that needs you. Live for them. Live for me." "I promise," Willa said, though she could barely speak past the lump in her throat. Flynn died peacefully in his sleep 2 nights later, with Willa beside him and all 3 of their children keeping vigil. They buried him on the mountain he loved, in a spot overlooking the valley where he could watch over his family forever. Willa mourned deeply, but she kept her promise. She lived for her children and grandchildren, finding joy in their visits and pride in their accomplishments. She stayed in the cabin Flynn had built, refusing all suggestions that she move to town. James remained with her, caring for her as she had once cared for him. She lived another 7 years, and on a peaceful autumn morning in 1922, she passed away in her sleep. Her children found her with a smile on her face, one hand clutching the wooden pendant Flynn had made her so many years ago. They buried her next to Flynn, reuniting them in death as they had been in life. The entire Barrett clan gathered for the funeral. Dozens of people whose very existence was a testament to the love story that had begun with a desperate woman and a lonely mountain man. On the shared headstone, William, Eleanor, and James had carved a simple inscription: "Flynn and Willa Barrett together, always he fed her soup, and never let her go hungry. She gave him a reason to live, and they lived well." The mountain homestead remained in the Barrett family for generations, passed down and cherished as a reminder of where it all began. The cabin was expanded and improved, but the original structure remained, a monument to the man and woman who had built a life there from nothing but determination and love. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the family gathered, the older members would tell the story of how it all started. They would speak of Willa Norton, starving and alone, stumbling into a creek ravine with nothing but hope. They would speak of Flynn Barrett, a lonely mountain man who found purpose in saving a stranger's life. They would speak of soup and kindness, of 2 people who found each other when they needed it most, of a love that endured every hardship and grew stronger with each passing year. It was a simple story, in many ways. A story of survival and compassion, of second chances and new beginnings. But it was also a love story for the ages, proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places, and that a single act of kindness can change everything. The Barrett family flourished, growing and spreading across the American West, but they never forgot their origins. They never forgot that it all began with a bowl of soup, a mountain cabin, and 2 people brave enough to choose love in a wild and unforgiving land. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not wealth or fame or easy lives, but love and family and the courage to hold on to both. Flynn and Willa Barrett had understood that from the beginning, and they had built their lives accordingly. They had created something lasting and beautiful, something that would endure long after they were gone. Their story was complete, their promise fulfilled. He had fed her and never let her go hungry, not just with soup, but with love, security, and devotion. She had given him purpose and family and joy beyond measure. Together, they had lived a life worth remembering, and their love story would be told for generations to come. The mountains stood eternal, watching over the Barrett family as they always had, silent witnesses to a love that had conquered loneliness, survived hardship, and proved that sometimes the hungriest hearts are the ones that learn to feed each other best.